The last time he hit me, my blood splattered on the window pane and stayed there for 3 winters. I didn't scream. Screaming only fed him. I folded inward like I'd learned to do, like a dying leaf in November. His fists weren't wild anymore, they were methodical, like he was checking off a list. Jaw, gut, back of the head. He knew where bruises didn't show. He was proud of that. My mother was in the kitchen. The water ran the whole time. I don't think she was washing anything. I think she just liked the noise, something to drown out her own cowardice. I lay curled in the corner, half conscious, half numb, trying to breathe without tasting blood. I remember a spider crawling across the cracked tile. I focused on it, counted its legs, named it. I gave it a life better than mine. In my head, it had a family that never screamed at each other. That night I couldn't sleep. My cheekbone throbbed against the pillow. I watched shadows move across the ceiling, thinking how the house itself seemed to recoil every time he raised his voice. Even wood has more sense than a woman who turns away. Years later, I drove past that same house in a silent black car, tinted windows rolled up. It looked smaller than I remembered, but the window, the one with the blood that never came out right, was still there. Just cleaner, whiter. My name was no longer on the mailbox, but it would be again. Just not the name they gave me. I learned to be silent from the first slap. It wasn't even that hard. He didn't hit me to knock me out, just enough to make a point. I was 7. I'd dropped a glass of water. That's all. I remember the crash, the sound of glass shattering across linoleum, and then his chair scraping back. He walked over slowly like he was tired. Then came the slap, open-handed, sharp, and precise. My head snapped sideways. "You're a boy. Act like it," he said. My mother was there. She was always there. She didn't flinch. She didn't look. She just kept folding laundry at the table like she hadn't heard anything. I wanted to cry, but my mouth stayed shut. Not out of bravery, just instinct. Crying would make him go longer. Afterward, I swept up the glass myself. My hand shook. One shard cut my thumb, and I hid the blood behind my back. That night, my mother came into my room. I thought she might ask if I was okay. She didn't. She told me, "You need to stop being so clumsy. You provoke him." That's when I learned something worse than pain. I learned that the truth meant nothing if no one would believe it. My mother believed in clean floors and folded shirts and silent dinners. She did not believe in me. I stopped speaking unless spoken to. I moved carefully like a ghost in training. I started keeping notebooks under my bed, writing things down so I wouldn't explode. I drew pictures of places that didn't exist. In every one there was no father, and the mothers had eyes. When I was older, I burned those notebooks. But I still remember the names of the places I invented. I still remember the first time I tasted silence and mistook it for safety. My father worked at a garage. My mother worked at forgetting. We lived in a crumbling 2-story house on the east side of Detroit, with gutters that screamed when it rained, and a porch that leaned forward like it wanted to run away. Inside, everything was beige. Beige walls, beige rugs, beige meals. The only color was the bruises on my body, and even those faded eventually. My father was a tall man. Strong hands, greasy fingernails. He smelled like motor oil and stale coffee. People in the neighborhood called him hard-working. They didn't see what I saw when the front door shut behind him, the way his mouth twisted before he said my name, the way his belt came off without hesitation, the way he laughed after. My mother, she wasn't cruel. That would have been easier. She was the kind of woman who sighed before speaking, who tucked her blouse in 3 times a day, who flinched when the phone rang. She didn't yell. She didn't hit. She just didn't care enough to stop anything. When he yelled, she stirred her tea. When I cried, she turned the volume up on the television. I used to sit at the kitchen table and look at them like they were strangers. And maybe they were. My father was a man who wanted obedience, not children. My mother was a woman who wanted peace, even if it meant silence was soaked in blood. They never hugged me. Not once. Birthdays were cards signed in the same handwriting. Love Mom and Dad with nothing else. No warmth. No glance. No cake unless I made it myself when I got old enough. I remember once around Christmas I asked my mother why she married him. She said because I didn't want to be alone. I was 10. I looked at her and thought, I am more alone than you'll ever be. I became an expert at vanishing in plain sight. At school, I smiled just enough to keep teachers from asking questions. I got straight A's because failure meant more attention at home, and attention was dangerous. I wore long sleeves year-round, even in spring. When kids asked, I said I was cold. No one pushed. No one ever pushes when the lie is neat. I learned to listen for footsteps for the way the front door shut when he came home. I could tell by the weight of his stride whether I should be upstairs pretending to sleep or downstairs pretending to help. I stopped asking for anything. No toys, no time, no tenderness. I became so easy to ignore that sometimes I forgot I was there. At night, I lay in bed, stiff as a board, my ears open to every creak in the house. I knew where the floor moaned, where the walls cracked in winter. I knew which cupboard she kept her Valium in and how many pills she took when she thought no one noticed. When I got older, I learned to fight back without lifting a hand. I locked the bathroom door. I turned 18 and applied to scholarships he didn't know about. I worked shifts under a fake name. I opened a bank account and memorized every digit. I hid cash in a box behind the insulation in my closet, but I still came home every night, because surviving doesn't mean leaving. It means knowing exactly when to. He broke my wrist once, said it was an accident. I'd grabbed a plate at the wrong moment. I wore a cast to school, told them I fell off my bike. A teacher squinted like she almost saw me. Almost. I kept my head down and thought one day I'll be so far gone no one will ever find me. He broke 2 of my ribs when I was 15. It was late after 10. I had stayed out finishing a shift at the grocery store. I needed the money for application fees. College was the only thing that kept me breathing. I came home quietly, shoes in hand, careful not to creak the door. He was waiting in the living room. Lights off. Just the blue flicker of the TV. A can of beer in his hand, half empty. He didn't say a word at first. Just stared at me. I froze. "Think you're grown now?" he asked. I said nothing. He stood up slow. Deliberate. The kind of slow that tells you there's no way out of what's coming. I said, and that's when the first hit landed. My side cracked like dry wood. I collapsed onto the floor, hands over my head. I didn't scream. I knew better than that. He kept going. Not wild. Measured. Like a man hammering a bent nail into the floor just to feel control. When it stopped, I couldn't breathe right. I lay on my side staring at the baseboard, counting the dust lines where the vacuum never reached. My cheek was pressed against the carpet. It smelled like beer sweat and quiet rage. She came down the stairs eventually. My mother. She didn't gasp, didn't kneel. She just stood there in her nightgown, arms folded across her chest like a robe could shield her from accountability. "He's your father," she whispered. "Stop provoking him." I laughed. It was weak, half-choked blood in my mouth. But I laughed, because that's when I knew I could die in this house and she'd wipe my blood off the floor and make tea before calling the cops. After that night, I slept with a flashlight under my pillow. Not to see, just to remember I wasn't helpless. I left. No one asked why. It wasn't dramatic. There were no shouts, no slammed doors, no packed bags in the rain. I just didn't come home one day. I had saved enough barely. Enough for a bus ticket, a deposit on a basement apartment with peeling paint, and a second-hand futon that smelled like cigarettes. I was 17, legally still theirs, spiritually long gone. The last morning in that house, I stood in front of the mirror and stared at myself. My jaw was still swollen. My ribs still ached when I breathed. But my eyes, they were the only part that looked alive, like something underneath had survived, something coiled and waiting. He was in the garage. She was upstairs doing laundry. I left the keys on the kitchen counter. I walked 4 blocks to the Greyhound station and didn't look back. Not once. For the first few nights I slept with all my clothes on. Habit. I kept the flashlight next to me on the mattress. I couldn't stand silence, so I let the radio play static. I'd wake up in the dark gasping sure I was back there. I'd feel the air for fists, for footsteps. I didn't talk to anyone for weeks. My voice had rusted. It cracked when I ordered coffee like it didn't know how to form words without apology. But I was out. That mattered more than anything. I wasn't free, not really, but I wasn't theirs anymore. I changed my name before I turned 18. Legally. Erased the one he gave me. Built a new one from the letters that meant something only to me. No middle name, no family tie. Just me. It was the first time I ever felt real. I built a life with silence as the foundation. Detroit swallowed me whole, and I let it. The city didn't ask questions. It didn't care where I came from or why I flinched when someone moved too fast. It just moved forward, always forward, and I learned to do the same. I worked 2 jobs, warehouse by day, diner by night. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. My body never let me rest. It was always ready to run, to defend, to disappear. The insomnia was like a roommate I never invited but couldn't live without. It whispered at 3 a.m. that I wasn't safe, that safety was a lie for other people. I enrolled in community college with forged documents and graduated with honors under a name that felt earned. Then came university. Then a master's in finance. Then the grind of work and more work and more work until money became the armor I never had growing up. I lived in glass buildings with doormen who smiled but never asked anything. I owned suits tailored to a body that still remembered what it felt like to curl up on dirty carpet and hold its breath. People called me brilliant, focused, ruthless. I let them. They didn't know that I didn't build a career, I built a fortress. Every promotion was a brick. Every transaction another lock on the door. I never dated, never brought anyone home. Home wasn't a place. It was a trigger. I was 32 when I saw the listing. The house. Their house. Foreclosure. I stared at the photos for a long time, same crooked porch, same white paint, same window I bled beside. It was cheap. Of course it was. Time had done what I never could. It beat the place down. I bought it under a shell company. My name never showed up in the paperwork. Not the one they gave me. The closing date was a Tuesday. I wore a navy suit calm as the sky before a storm. I returned without making a sound. They didn't recognize the man who stepped out of the black sedan. My face had changed, thinner, sharper, carved by years of insomnia and steel. I carried a briefcase, not a bruised cheek. My voice was calm, deliberate. I said their address like it meant nothing to me, like it wasn't burned into my memory by 10 years of hell. My father opened the door. He was smaller than I remembered. His shoulders hunched, belly heavier, but his eyes still held that flicker of control of pride in his own cruelty. It made my skin crawl. "Can I help you?" he asked, annoyed. I nodded politely. "You've been served. This property has been sold. You have 30 days to vacate." His face crumpled. "That's a mistake." "No mistake," I said. "It was a bank auction. Everything was handled legally." He called for my mother. She appeared behind him, wrapped in a faded robe. Her hair was gray now. Her lips moved like she wanted to protest, but no words came. She stared at me. Something in her eyes shifted. Not recognition, just fear that recognition was coming. Who are you?" she whispered. I looked at her for a long time. I didn't smile. I didn't blink. "Someone you raised poorly." She gasped. He stepped forward, voice rising. "You think you can just come in here? I already did." I turned away, walked to the car. The papers were signed. The deed was in the briefcase. I'd already changed the locks. They screamed behind me. Empty threats, empty lungs. The porch groaned under their weight as they followed me, yelling like it still meant something. But I didn't hear them. I was already gone. They tried to fight it, filed complaints, cried to the neighbors, told stories about some fraud stealing their home. My father marched into the city office with yellowed documents and an angry voice, thinking that volume was still power. My mother played the part of the fragile wife, asking for pity she never gave. But the law didn't care. The paperwork was flawless. The bank's trail was clean. The company that bought the house was faceless, efficient, unshakable. Every legal route they took ended in a cold letter or a quiet click on a phone line. No one called back. I made sure of that. They had no savings. He'd pissed it away on cigarettes and wasted weekends. She'd never worked more than part-time. The mortgage had gone unpaid for months. Their world had shrunk down to borrowed time and denial. I didn't watch them leave. I waited until the eviction was final. Then I walked through the house again. Alone. The kitchen was smaller than I remembered. The wallpaper peeling. The floor still had that one uneven tile I used to step over like it might bite. I stood in the corner where I'd once curled up, clutching my ribs, praying for time to speed up. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like reclaiming space, like digging up a body and burying it properly. I left the living room last. On the coffee table, I placed a copy of the property deed. It bore my new name, bold, legal, untouchable. No note, no farewell. Just paper proof that I had turned their home into my proof of life. They never saw me again. I didn't leave a number. I didn't answer the letters they sent to the management company, the pleading ones written in my mother's trembling cursive, pretending they didn't know. Pretending they'd raised a stranger. Maybe they did. Maybe the boy they raised, the one who begged silently with his eyes, who learned to bleed quietly, who waited for a scrap of kindness. Maybe he died the night they left him on the floor, coughing through a cracked rib while the washing machine hummed upstairs. What remained was someone colder, someone quieter. A man who knew how to speak in contracts instead of cries. I sold the house 6 months later, renovated it first just enough to erase the scent of misery from the drywall. I left the blood-stained window intact. Not out of sentiment. Just to remind myself even glass doesn't forget. In my dreams, they still find me sometimes. I'm back in the hallway. I'm 7. He's holding the belt. She's holding silence like a shield. But in the waking world, I sleep in a high-rise above the river. My doors lock with a code. My name is mine. My hands don't shake anymore. People ask why I never go home for holidays. I tell them I don't have one. They laugh, think I'm being poetic. They don't know the truth. Home isn't where you come from. It's where you finally stop flinching. And I don't flinch anymore.